So that brings me on to, I think, a gripe that both of us share, and that is the lack of accountability from the football club, particularly from those that cover the patch, Liverpool based journalists and people that seem to want to just shout down anybody that questions the narrative of the club or questions, like you've just said, one or two additions every season. We get often called Chelsea fans, City fans, we want a multitude of signings, and we spoke about this a little bit off air before we started. There's always extremes on every end of this, but most people are in the middle of this. And most people, like you've correctly said, want those one or two quality additions to just finish the squad. I think Jurgen Klopp said it best when he said one or two new faces is healthy every campaign. Freshens up the training ground, freshens up the positivity around the club, keeps people on their toes. So, how do you feel about some of the media that cover the football club not really ever pushing back on these things or running to the defence of the club?
Yeah, it's another source of frustration for me, I'm afraid. So, in addition to having worked in finance and being an accountant, I've had an even longer tenure working in the media outside of my day job, and have worked in for a variety of media outlets over the years, and so I have a very good understanding about um, the circumstances that involve modern day journalists and the kind of pressures that they're under, the deadlines that they have to hit, the content, the volume that they have to churn out day in, day out, and also about relationships that are expected to be maintained. And some of these are relationships that, if a journalist goes and says something that might upset a club or their ownership or both, and that potentially could jeopardize the relationship between the outlet and the club and all the owners, then that could, worst case, cost somebody their job. I also observe the way in which owners and clubs are covered by patch journalists elsewhere. And you see much of the same, but you also see when things are not going so well, when there are things that need to be perhaps scrutinised a bit more or questioned at the very least, that we see a bit more of that elsewhere. So if you take Manchester United as an example, with the Manchester Evening News, and some of the other patch journos that cover it for national titles, there often is a bit more scrutiny and a little bit more balance when it comes to looking at the Glazers, Ineos, and the actions of the club. And then I could compare and contrast that to Liverpool Football Club and the way in which its patch journos behave. And I like many out there try to be balanced and objective about how the owners operate. And if you listen to my podcast and have done so for a while, you'll know that there have been many times that I've praised FSG and the way in which they do things. There's a lot that they've got wrong as well. And when I feel that they've gotten things wrong or they could have done things better or more effectively, I will call them out and stuff like that. And yet, I sometimes feel like I'm a bit of a lone voice. That too many outlets, even fan channels, are a bit reluctant to openly question, never mind criticize the ownership. And the reason I have an issue with that is, I started out in the '90s in terms of my work in the media, and you know, that was drilled into me from day one that look, you've got to be objective, you've got to treat your subjects um, in a way that's as impartial as possible, build up good, healthy relationships, but at the same time, they need to know that when you're going to cover them, if you feel that they deserve scrutiny, you scrutinize them. And yet, there's too much silence over things that I think should be scrutinised. If you look at the summer transfer window from a few months ago, we ended it, in a season where Jurgen came so close yet far from winning that title. A new manager coming in, or a coach, I should say, and to essentially have no investment into that squad. Elsewhere, there would have been uproar. A lot of criticism of the ownership. And again, I say that the recruitment strategy is driven by the ownership. This is an ownership, by the way, that has a fundamental um, issue with the way in which transfers work within football. They come from a different sport, baseball. and it operates in a very different way. And I sort of get their frustrations with the system of transfers in football, and I do get it. And there are flaws to the way it works, but we're all stuck with it. And if you want to compete, if you want to attract talent, if you want to stay at the top, you've got to play by those games and by those rules. And the days of trying to outdo your rivals by outsmarting them by getting a £15 million signing and hoping that they'll blossom into someone that's world class is increasingly difficult, because more and more of these clubs are better than they were when we had our recruitment purple patch of between 2016 and 2018. A lot of our rivals were kind of sleeping at the wheel. Manchester United, when it came to transfer ID of talent, were all over the shop, and various other clubs were too. And most of them have upped their game. I mean, they still make some of our rivals some right howlers when it comes to recruitment. But it's things like that, things like the wage bill, things like owner investment. Just I'm not saying they should criticise the ownership, but at least have these debates and discussions. And instead, there's too many journalists, too many within fan channels who decide, right, let's look at an extreme fan who's calling for something completely unrealistic, belittle and demean them, and just brush the whole of this group of fans who may in any way criticise the owners by that one or two select few individuals. And that kind of gaslighting just needs to stop. And let's have some open and honest and fair and balanced discussions. And there's just some complete absence of that within our fan base when it comes to the club and the ownership. And it seems like the only times that any of these outlets will ever say anything remotely negative about the club and the ownership is if somebody like Spirit of Shankly says, well, it's outrageous that. Don't get me wrong, I get on with Spirit of Shankly. I've had somebody from their group on my podcast in the past, in Joe, and they do some great work. But at the same time, it seems like it's when they say something that everyone else will then say, okay, right, maybe the club shouldn't be doing that. That's not how it should be. So, grow a pair is my suggestion to the journalists out there. Um, Look, there are people like me. There's much more prominent people like Swiss Ramble, Kieran Maguire. If you're uncomfortable about delving into the subject of finance because it's not your area of expertise, that's all fine. But at least go and speak to people. And there are one or two that do, get some advice off of me when they write their stories, and I'm happy to provide some kind of steer. But we need to see a lot more of that. And I think only then, when the ownership is held to greater account, will we start seeing things that can start to change in a positive way. And the other thing I just wanted to say is that you get a lot of fans who say we're top of this league, we're top of that league. What you're all moaning about? Shut up! No, you shut up, because we can appreciate what's going on the pitch and admire it and revel in it and enjoy every moment. And this is turning into a great season. We all hope that Liverpool will end the season with at least the Premier League and possibly more. But the reason we take concern over things like recruitment is because it's okay, that's all well and good for now, but what about next year? So if, as we all know, the three players whose contracts have only a few more months to run all disappear, all three of whom are world class, best centre back in world football, best wide forward in world football, arguably the best right back in world football. To replace those players like for like, I estimate it to be about 400 million. Absolute worst case, in terms of lowest amount, probably 300 million. And that's before we even address positions like left back and DM. So come on, are we even going to get to the point where all three of those disappear, and still there will be no criticism or questioning of the owners and their model? So that's why I think things need to change, and we'd just like to see a bit more of a balanced approach rather than this kind of very black and white, support the owners, support the club at all costs. Anyone that criticises must be pilloried, must be mocked, must be denigrated. That's all complete and utterly uncalled for. Let's grow up now. We're all adults, and that kind of nonsense needs to stop.
Well, I've certainly been on the end of that ire, frustration, and belittling from many people who try to paint a lot of us into this, as you said, very extreme view. And speaking with you beforehand, I said to you, I give FSG credit for so many things they've done at the club. They're by far not the worst owners, but that doesn't mean that they get a free pass. They have to be held to account on things that we feel deserve questioning, and the lack of additions or the lack of these contracts being sorted out